All right, welcome everyone to the What's the Future of the Clean Fuels Tax Credit. I'm Kelsey Brugger. I'm a reporter at E&E News, and I cover energy politics on Capitol Hill. I'm on Capitol Hill at the moment in one of these sort of soundproof house gallery booths. So thanks so much for joining us. Obviously, one of the big fights up here is one of the biggest things that we're following this year is the Republican reconciliation bill that's looking to extend the 2017 tax cuts. Among the potential pay fors are, of course, some of the price tags. The biggest price tags are the Inflation Reduction Act clean energy tax credits. So today we're going to zero in on one in particular, the Clean Fuels Production Tax Credit, or 45Z. And we have a panel of experts here to kind of address this debate from different areas. One is the subsidies economic pros and cons, the environmental trade-offs, and then, of course, just the politics of it all and how lawmakers are considering its fate. So I'm going to introduce the panelists and then let them tell us a little bit about their work. We have, I'm going to butcher everyone's last name, I'm sure, Alex Murashanu, Senior Policy Analyst at the Tax Foundation, Dan Raitu at the Breakthrough Institute, Director of Food and Agriculture, and Nan Swift, a resident fellow the governance program at R Street. So thanks so much for joining us. And Alex, let's start with you to hear a little bit about your work.
Yeah, so big picture. Thank you for hosting, Kelsey, and thank you to R Street and my co-panelists. I think from the big picture with environmental policy, is at the sort of ideal climate policy people always go to is carbon pricing. And that, the idea behind carbon pricing is you set some sort of social cost of carbon and you let the market figure out, what the best way to reduce emissions is. Is it switching from coal to natural gas? Is it renewable? Is it, renewables and electricity generation? Is it electric vehicles? Or are certain emissions sort of not worth getting rid of, that the value that they produce for people is higher than their environmental costs? So that's the ideal policy. And I think there has been sort of a political challenges with carbon pricing. So people move on to the sort of second tier option, which is subsidies for green technology. Now, the sort of what you hope is that these subsidies are focused on activities that are relatively sort of inexpensive for their emissions reduction, or are the sort of things that if a carbon price was implemented, we would see a lot of. There are some arguments that the clean electricity production credit, for instance, has relatively low abatement costs. This is the sort of activity we'd expect to see if we had a carbon price. So, it's not ideal, you don't have the marginal incentive to switch from coal to natural gas to reduce emissions. It's not ideal policy by any means, but, it's a little bit closer to what it incentivizes the sort of behavior we would expect from a carbon price, maybe. Now, what you are sort of worried about, and this is sort of a key argument for carbon pricing and against subsidies, is you have subsidies for emissions reduction measures that aren't very good and maybe are even counterproductive. And that is sort of where a lot of these provisions, including, again, a topic of the matter, the Clean Fuels Production Credit, ends up. Now, I can turn over, I think, Dan and my other co-panelists have more details there, but that's sort of a big picture to think about the carbon pricing versus the IRA and differentiating different, IRA credits from each other.
Cool, thanks. Dan?
Thanks everyone for joining. I'm Dan Raitu. I'm with the Breakthrough Institute. If you're not familiar with us, we're a think tank that focuses on modernizing environmental politics and policy, and in our food and ag work, we mostly focus on innovation and productivity growth as ways of improving sustainability. I'll provide a little bit of background first about the 45Z tax credits. For those who are unfamiliar with it, it primarily provides producers of alternative fuels with a tax credit of about 2 cents per gallon for every kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalent that's abated or reduced for non-aviation transportation fuels, and about 3.5 cents for aviation fuels, specifically sustainable aviation fuel, sometimes referred now as synthetic aviation fuel by the administration. And that's as long as the carbon intensity of these fuels falls below a certain threshold, in this case, a carbon intensity of 50 or so. Now, I mostly want to argue that there is no plausible pathway really for traditional crop-based or food-based biofuels, corn, ethanol, and soy biodiesel, to meet this carbon intensity threshold and really qualify for the tax credits, or to otherwise substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions. To do that, first you need to understand a little bit about how carbon intensity is calculated for the tax credit. It's done so primarily using what's called the GREET model, which is developed and maintained by the Department of Energy. And this accounts for the life cycle emissions of biofuels, including some estimates of land use change. And now with 45Z coming forward, there is a proposed method to account for farming practices, such as tillage practices or cover cropping on farms that supply corn, soy, sorghum, and other feedstocks for biofuels. Now, that might sound like it's really in the weeds, but it's really critical because those farming practices and the carbon benefits estimated for them will often make the difference between whether a farm qualifies for the credit at all or doesn't. It also has a significant impact on how large of a credit farms and the overall farm sector could receive. Now, I'll maybe just touch on one or two issues with this. One major issue with this proposed approach for looking at the carbon impact of farming practices is it doesn't account for additionality. That is, it doesn't distinguish between farms that are newly adopting a farming practice, like cover crops, in response to the tax credit, and therefore maybe sequestering some additional carbon. Doesn't distinguish between those and the farms that have been using these practices for years, maybe even decades. That is significant because the majority, about 75% of corn, soy, and sorghum farmers already use some type of conservation tillage. So there's a real risk here that the credit could go primarily to farmers just to keep doing what they've been doing for a while, thereby not actually reducing emissions and achieving the policy's goals. Another major issue with this proposed approach is it assumes farmers will keep implementing these practices for 30 years. That's how the carbon benefits are calculated. The credit expires in 2027, so I think it's anyone's guess how this would be enforced. But also, farmers typically change up their practices pretty often. They might even switch what crops they grow in response to different market conditions. USDA reports that about half of corn and soy farmers that use no-till farming and cover crops do so inconsistently. And when they do that, when they switch things up, it re-releases much of the carbon that's sequestered in the soil. I guess the last thing I'll touch on is, even if you put aside these farming practices, some people might say, aren't biofuels lower carbon than gasoline already? Maybe it doesn't matter if we're getting the math right on the farming practices. And that's largely what the GREET model finds, that biofuels on average are lower carbon. But more and more analyses are finding quite the opposite, disagreeing quite vociferously with the GREET model. So EPA's most recent report from January, for instance, finds that the renewable fuel standard, which is the primary policy supporting biofuels right now, has a quote, modest negative effect on the environment. And that's mostly because of the land use footprint of biofuels. We use an area the size of Iowa. We use an area the size of all of the cropland in Iowa for biofuels right now. And some of the simplest approaches for estimating the carbon footprint of that, just looking at the average carbon cost of converting land to farming to basically make up for land that's taken away from food and feed production, finds that the carbon cost is about 10 times higher than what GREET, the model that's used here for 45Z, finds. So that has major implications, I think, for how this policy should be reformed or how policymakers should look at it.
Thank you. And Nan?
Thanks, Dan, for that really helpful overview. So as Kelsey mentioned at the top, I am a resident fellow with our governance program here at R Street, but they kindly let me dabble in the energy space because this is something that I've worked on for many, many, many years over the length and breadth of my career. Right now, kind of all eyes are on reconciliation to see what the future of this tax credit should be. And that is one part of the equation. And it's a really hard equation to square. They need to come up with a lot of money and to pay for the Republican priorities, namely making permanent the TCJA tax reforms, as well as achieve some deficit reduction on the House side, and pay for some immigration changes and defense plus up. So there's a lot of things that they want to do. And we've seen some committee chairmen take pay fors off the table. So the margins are getting pretty slim. But that's just one factor in the future of this credit. I think that we also really need to be looking at some of the other big changes outside Capitol Hill, I should say, namely tariffs and retaliatory tariffs that are going to be negatively affecting commodity growers, particularly corn and soy, as well as this underreported port levy that USTR is considering applying to Chinese-owned, operated, built ships, which will also really, really hurt those same row crop growers. And this is after, despite several years in a row of record high income, perpetual claims of poor and economic ruin by those same farmers. And I won't deny that there have been some challenges, but I do think those are overstated. So there's a lot of dynamics at play here, far beyond TCJA and the reconciliation drama around all that. I think that Alex was being extremely generous and diplomatic when he said that part of 45Z was, looking to help move our economy toward an increased use of green technology. I have a slightly more jaundiced view, and I think it's really looking around to find more ways to use corn so far as possible, because RFS has kind of hit the pun intended blend wall when it comes to how much corn we can use. And if other markets are going to be importing a lot less corn, or it's going to be a lot more costly, then we need to find more places to stick our corn. Unfortunately, we've seen this story before, and this is my biggest concern when it comes to this issue. And this is really out of the RFS playbook, the Renewable Fuel Standard, as Dan already mentioned. That really started with tax credits going back to the 70s, but then in the early 2000s. But that wasn't enough for corn growers and ethanol producers. They needed a mandate. And already the ink is barely dry on this tax credit. And we already see ethanol producers saying, this doesn't go far enough. We need a mandate. We need a sustainable aviation fuel mandate. And I'm worried that we might be going down that road again. And as Dan and Alex have already explained, this is not a good road.
Well, we will definitely get back to some of those points for sure. But let's go back to Alex, and if you could, Alex, just sort of like zoom out a little bit for us, and talk about this broader sort of economic pros and cons of these subsidies, and specifically for 45Z, like how much are we even talking about, really? Like how much money are we talking about? How much they're expected to cost, and like what other factors are at play here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think going back to what Nan was saying, I think there's in trying to think of who it was, if it's Paul Krugman or some other economist who talks about arguing with ghosts. I think there are some interesting ghosts in this conversation, where I think a lot of renewable energy and low carbon energy, I think often get conflated, and you have policies that were developed with dependence on foreign oil as like some sort of guiding concern. And that's how you get the idea of like renewable fuels. The idea is not that they are necessarily better for the environment to begin with, but that they are non-depletable, and that we can grow them, or build them perpetually. Which is not the same at all as or not necessarily the same as reducing emissions. And so I think, there are a lot of, this is sort of a policy area that is a leftover from the days of worrying about peak oil, or, US dependence on Middle Eastern oil. And less actually sort of an organic, for lack of pardon the pun, I guess, as sort of not an organic environmental policy, rather than an attempt to sort of shoehorn something that doesn't belong in the environmental policy conversation. So we recently released a revenue estimate for repeal of the IRA in aggregate, and we have sort of line item provisions. Our estimate, we found that repealing the clean fuels production credit would raise around $12.8 billion over a decade. That was based on some estimates from Treasury. It doesn't make sense to take a revenue cost estimate from Treasury and assume it will one-for-one translate into revenue raised from reversing a policy. Sort of an in-depth topic there, but that's not a huge number when we're talking about the broader reconciliation conversation. But every little bit counts, and there will be fights over amounts that are smaller than around $13 billion over 10 years. And it's worth noting that that's mostly condensed in a couple of years, because the policy is scheduled to be temporary. And so, I think that just because it's not that big relative to, a $4.5 trillion tax bill, a $4 trillion tax bill includes a lot of individual billions of dollars. And that doesn't mean it won't be a significant part of the debate.
And what about, can you talk at all about extending the TCJA and what maybe some of those sort of pro-growth provisions look like, and how, that could be sort of an economic trade-off here?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think the most important pro-growth policies in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act were was the introduction of 100% bonus depreciation, which short version, it lets companies deduct the cost of basically equipment and machinery immediately, rather than spreading those deductions out. Spreading those deductions out amounts to a tax penalty, because over time, thanks to inflation, a deduction in the future is worth less than a deduction today. There's also opportunity costs that comes with delaying a deduction, meaning that, if you could deduct it today, you could reinvest the money in your business as well. And so moving to 100% bonus depreciation, they did that temporarily. It started phasing out at the end of 2022. So bringing back 100% bonus depreciation, that is one of those sort of big pro-growth policies. And bringing back expensing for R&D, research and development spending, deducting that right away instead of spreading deductions out. This was sort of a gimmick intended to raise some revenue, but no one really wanted it to take effect, and just policymakers sort of forgot about it, and political dysfunction meant it ended up taking effect anyway. That would also be a pro-growth a policy to extend or bring back, really. And so, those provisions aren't a huge share of the overall bill. That's, going to be at most like roughly half a trillion of a $4.5 trillion package, before accounting for any sort of economic feedback. Most of any sort of dynamic revenue, which is revenue that you get back from a tax policy growing the economy, most of that dynamic revenue is going to come from those two provisions when we're thinking about extension. So I think those are the most sort of pro-growth policies to think about. There's also the reduction in individual income tax rates, which do matter as well for growth. And then as far as like the sort of average person, the expansions of the CTC and, the average person's like line item tax code, expansions of the CTC and the standard deduction are matter as well. But as far as long run growth and prosperity, it's those business provisions, R&D, and equipment expensing.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. Dan, I want to go back to you. I know you talked a bit about sort of the environmental trade-offs here. But if you could elaborate a little bit and maybe talk a little bit about how you think this, that could be reformed or changed, or like what would you in a perfect world like to see?
So first, just to clarify, there are other fuels that are eligible for this tax credit. I think I saw someone in the Q&A ask about natural gas, for instance. Basically, many different fuels, as long as they meet this emissions threshold, could qualify. This is the credit is meant to be technology neutral, but certainly how carbon intensity is calculated for every type of fuel and feedstock is different and really matters. So some of the reforms really need to be really in the weeds when it comes to those calculations. So I think first the credits, whether it's in the actual rule that's finalized by Treasury or whether it's in the Department of Energy's GREET model itself, needs to account for this issue of additionality. It makes no sense to provide a credit to farmers or other businesses that aren't actually changing their practices. We wouldn't do that in other industries and areas and shouldn't here. Likewise, with permanence, I think the estimates really need to be based upon a time frame over which the regulations and rules and requirements can actually be enforced and reported and verified. And beyond that, there are a number of kind of more technical issues that should be resolved. There should probably be some type of actual measurements or sampling of the actual changes in soil carbon and greenhouse gas emissions on farms due to different practices, because the models that we have right now are just not very precise at the national level. What works in Iowa won't necessarily work in Kansas, and the models aren't really great at capturing that. So some type of measurement could help. Perhaps more importantly, and this would affect the RFS as well, and perhaps some other policies, the method that the DOE, Department of Energy, uses to calculate land use change should be, I think, fundamentally changed. They use this computable general equilibrium model that takes account all of these different dynamic effects, has thousands of parameters, but honestly, a deep dive into that model recently found that only a handful of those parameters are really based in economic research. Most of them are just assumptions. Many of them come out of the model itself. It has a very weak empirical backing, and so can come up with these really unrealistic estimates. It's really not fit for purpose for a tax credit. Using a different approach that just looks at the opportunity cost of land use would be much more similar to how the carbon impact of products is generally calculated. If we try and estimate the carbon impact of a car, for instance, usually we say, okay, a car, we're going to attribute a share of the carbon impact from building, an automobile manufacturing plant to each car. But for farming and biofuels, that's not what we do, but it is what we should do. We should assume that every acre, every bushel, every gallon requires a share of all of the land use that needs to be converted to farming. So those are a couple of the changes I would like to see. I think that ultimately, if the models were properly updated in that way, you would find that these food or crop-based biofuels wouldn't ultimately be eligible. But I should see those changes take place first.
All right. And Nan, let's talk a little. I won't ask you to make your prediction about what's going to happen here, but let's talk a little bit about. I mean, you touched on this of like the renewable, fuel lobby. I was new on reporting on Capitol Hill. I'll tell you, in 2023 when the Iowa delegation was leaving Kevin McCarthy's office, and they all came out, and it was really clear that they were fighting for a carve out in the debt ceiling bill, which was just sort of like the Republican stake in the ground that wanted to repeal all of the IRA, and they said like absolutely not for the biofuels, and so that carve out, they were successful there. So like the politics here, which I know you touched on, but like just talk to me a little bit about how you're thinking about this in Congress, particularly the moment that we're in. Strange bedfellow stories are always interesting. We're talking about subsidies, and then also really red areas of the country, right? So just talk to us a little bit about the politics here.
Well, these are really tricky dynamics. As you mentioned, there are so many facets to what is going on here. I'll start by saying that for sure, the egg industry as a whole, corn growers in particular, do wield a lot of power. Iowa's first in the country status when it comes to primaries is a big part of that. As you already mentioned, the fact that these are often red counties and red states is another factor. But that's just not the whole story. Well, and there is also the fact that there's very slim margins of error for Republicans in both chambers, but that goes both ways. And you saw that with Massey staying off the House reconciliation bill, the House budget vote, and Chip Roy raising concerns there. At the same time, you had a group of 21 Republicans raising this as a priority, all from corn country to maintain it, saying hands off 45Z in any reconciliation package. So this is tough. But at the same time, corn growers and the Corn Caucus hasn't had a string of unmitigated wins. For instance, they did have a year-round E15 provision in one of the early drafts of the Christmas continuing resolution, but that didn't make the final cut. On the other hand, as soon as he got into office, the president did urge EPA to consider a year-round E15 waiver. So the future of this fuel goes up and down day by day. And as I already mentioned, the dynamics of tariffs and natural disasters and all kinds of other things happening in farm country play a big role in this as well. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important to remember that Iowans and farmers and corn growers, while they do share a lot of values, they're not a monolith. No one is. No one area, state, region. I mean, northern and southern farmers are different. People are different from, Pennsylvania to Maryland farmers are different. Everyone is different. And while you may have seen the Iowans marching out of the McCarthy office in 2023, is a very different story in 2016 when then candidate Ted Cruz won Iowa. And he was the only one who did so opposing the ethanol mandate. All the other presidential candidates at the time, when they had campaigned there, had capitulated in one way or another. He wasn't just silent on it. He has a long track record of opposing the ethanol mandate. And not only did he win, he put up his biggest numbers in the corn heaviest districts. Now, we're coming up on a decade. A lot has changed, maybe, but I think that's an important example for everyone to remember. And hopefully it's an example that gives Republicans who have at least some skepticism about the role of this tax credit some courage to say, we can make a good policy decision here and not necessarily suffer electoral consequences as a result of only this. Farmers have a lot of other priorities as well. They have a lot of other values, and this isn't necessarily always at the top of the list.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Oh, Dan, go ahead.
Just wanted to add to what Nan was saying, that in addition to there being different opinions, of course, within the corn farming population, a policy like this will have different impacts on different sectors of the agricultural economy. So generally speaking, biofuel policies have slightly raised the cost of food, primarily soybean oil, as well as feed, corn, for the livestock industry. That doesn't have a huge impact once it trickles down to the consumer, but certainly it's increased livestock feed prices somewhere on the order of 10 or 30%, according to a number of analyses over the past number of years, and that's, I think, today highly politically salient, with ag prices just coming down and a number of other pressures, especially as Nan pointed out, with tariffs being put in place on U.S. beef and other meat products and other livestock products. One thing too also is, building on what you're saying, Nan, there's a number of other policy instruments and legislative vehicles that arguably would provide larger markets or more safety to farmers right now. So the Farm Bill, for instance, has been kicked down the road time and time again. And the longer it's pushed back, the more pressure there will be for policymakers and the ag community to try and get whatever they can to bolster prices, to create markets. Maybe that will be 45Z, but I think there's a real risk in relying on something like this, because although it might expire in 2027, I think we all know that tax credits are really hard to kill. They keep being renewed over and over again. So there's a real risk of lock-in here.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. one thing that I was thinking about was just like in terms of administratively, obviously we're in the beginning of a new administration. Wondering if someone, maybe honestly, any of you could talk about like how the Trump administration could mitigate the costs of these subsidies. If the model is shifted. Obviously we've seen a lot of reporting on the administration looking at all things that are like sort of climate coded. Obviously there's the Administrative Procedures Act that they would have to go through to make changes, I believe, right? So yeah, does someone can someone kind of help me think through that? Dan, Alex, do you have
Yeah, I
thoughts?
guess I have like a short thought. Maybe Dan will have more sophisticated input here. Maybe I don't want to put you on the spot, Dan. I don't mean to do that. But the one of the interesting dynamics here is that the way that mitigating the cost of a policy through sort of executive branch changes in regulation or procedure in some ways may kneecap your legislative goals if your goal is to use something as a pay for, because the CBO makes their assessment. Well, CBO or JCT will make their assessment based on what current law is, and so if you actually change the regulation in a way that reduces the cost of the credit, repealing the credit is not going to raise as much money. Now, generally, my understanding is, and I'm not probably not the strongest person on administrative procedure, is that these regulations sort of procedures or approaches often take quite a long time to officially roll back. And so in the context of the legislative window, like maybe they don't, that CBO will still, score score things as if the old rules are still on the book. If it is sort of a long process to get through and change within the executive branch. So maybe that doesn't end up having an effect on the process after all. But that is a possible dynamic to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That makes sense. Did you want to jump in, Dan, or you're all set on that?
I wouldn't add much. I would just note that at least for some of the methods I was talking about, these calculation methods that could determine really the size of the tax credit and how many farms are really eligible. Those methods are in a interim rule right now. It's a interim technical guidelines and calculation of greenhouse gas benefits from biofuels from USDA. Those rules or those guidelines don't necessarily need to be adopted by the Department of Energy for this model, and Treasury and others can basically provide some input as well about what the requirements are for the model. They've said that earlier versions of the REIT model were not fit for purpose, and that DOE needed to adopt a new version. So there is some input and some room for change on the margins here right now.
Okay. Okay. I'm kind of thinking about some of the reporting that I've done recently, which is just talking to some of these members. Some of the Nan mentioned those 21 Republicans who signed on to that letter. They didn't mention specific clean energy programs, but they did talk about transferability. They did talk about kind of overall how businesses have been accessing these credits and are sort of coming to life throughout the country. And so I guess what I found interesting was they put out this second public letter. There was a similar one last summer, and then I also talked to to Buddy Carter, not on this specific tax credit, but about if this was a hill he was going to die on, right? And he said no, essentially. And so, like, I guess I just found that sort of interesting. Like, is this sort of like signaling to the speaker's office, like, don't make us take this hard vote? If this, this is something that could cost us our seat. Like in terms of the politics and like sort of the back channeling that is happening right now. Like, I don't know, Nan, if you have thoughts about like how members, I guess, could be most successful here, and like what you think their like sort of strategy is. Does that make sense?
Well, I don't think anyone is counting any votes before they're cast, or at least I would hope that no one is making a lot of assumptions before we see what the text is. But as negotiations are happening, I mean, we've seen that one or two Republican members can hold anything. They can hold the speaker hostage over what they decide is their hill to die on. But as you stated, it seems like so far no one is saying it is. So I would hope that that means that there's still a healthy back and forth going on. But if someone decided this was it, then they certainly have the capacity to do so, unless there's something else that they can be given by leadership, especially with margins like this in both chambers, and even in the Senate, where each senator has a lot more authority unto themselves than representatives do. But each one right now wields a great deal of power and can be making a case for what's most important to them. I think that this isn't an easy time right now to make predictions, as we kind of already alluded to. I'm sure that this is a conversation, but I don't know that there's just an easy set of dials and things that people can be turning up or down to get to the perfect match right now. And making guesses about that is just not going to be productive until we see where things come down for groups like R Street or Tax Foundation and Breakthrough. The best thing that we can be doing is providing members with the best information about the choices they're making, and then hope that they make better ones, and hope that their constituents are going to put good policy over politics.
And I think this week the House and the Senate leaders are going to be talking about some like top line numbers, right? And maybe trying to kind of like figure out if they can get to reach an agreement, because they're still pretty far apart. I mean, how does that impact this?
I think they're probably really far away from debating kind of the nitty gritty. And I would say that this one tax credit would still be in the nitty gritty. Although certainly it's on a wish list for a lot of members, but we don't even know yet if the House and Senate can find agreement between their 2-bill or 1-bill plans. So when we don't even have agreement on how many bills we're going to do and the sequence, let alone the top line, this is really far down the list. So again, but for producers, for makers of ethanol, for the customers who want to use this and are planning on using the tax credit to their advantage, this is going to be important to them too. But so are a lot of the other TCJA provisions, as Alex already mentioned. There's a lot of things on the line for a lot of people to varying degrees. And that's my really mushy answer.
and like, what's your sense of what the lobbying looks like? Is there a danger with some of these lobbies or trade groups that they are sort of arguing against themselves if they want to extend certain provisions, but then are also making a case for the tax credits?
I'm not sure. Actually, I think from the little I've seen, because I'm not directly in that world anymore. I used to be, but I'm not right now. But actually, I think the biggest concerns for a lot of the groups that would be most active on this right now are tariffs and the port levy that I mentioned. They have been going to the wall over these things. They're coming up against a hard deadline of April 1st and 2nd, depending on which direction the tariffs might be coming from. They're really desperate to stop some other things that could have a much bigger impact on their bottom line and their ability to access markets.
Okay.
Sorry, I have to add, you mentioned strange bedfellows earlier, and I mean, just I think it was Friday or first thing yesterday, there was a letter about the port levy that had like over 200 signatories. I'm forgetting the exact number, but it was many, 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 and it wasn't just retailers and some of the usual suspects, but it was also like every type of association that grows or produces anything that you can think of. And these are folks that, at least when it comes to energy, are not often on the same page. But on this, they all see the harm and they're linking hands, and that's top of mind.
Interesting, really interesting. We have a question from the audience about the waste emissions charge, which was the IRA methane fee that was, I think, just CRA'd. Is that, are you all, I know that's a little, is that something that you all were paying attention to, or have thoughts about, what happens to that, or where, where a methane tax goes from here?
I have some familiarity with the policy. So I guess relevant for or adjacent to a lot of the conversation we've had already, it's notable that the methane fee is focused on oil and gas, and it does not cover most the agricultural sector, which is actually a larger source of methane than fugitive emissions from oil and gas operations. So that's just always worth keeping in mind with the policy. It's really an oil and gas methane fee, not a methane fee. And I think, I'm not sure exactly what the regulatory issue has been with it. I mean, my recollection is that this was, passed as part of the IRA as a would have to ergo be rolled back through legislation. But it's not a particularly significant policy in terms of dollars and cents, but it would be yeah, my recollection is it's under $1 billion a year in terms of revenue. That order of magnitude. I might be wrong about that, but that's the sort of magnitude we're talking about. So I don't think I think there's a chance that it gets rolled back, but we'll see.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about, I want to talk about how, because in terms of how I'm thinking about this tax credit and how it overlaps with the renewable fuel standard, like maybe if someone can kind of like just talk a little bit about how these policies are, just overlap, or how best to think about them. Does anyone want to dive in?
I mean, I can talk about that for hours. Why don't I give it a try, and then Dan will correct me or add. So the renewable, well, and I'll back up to say, actually, this is where I see this whole thing, this whole saga overlapping, and that is that early in the 2000s we had was the volume ethanol excise tax credit, or VEAT-C, which was a similar tax credit to 45Z, which provided a tax credit to anyone who blended ethanol into their fuel supply. And this was a boon for everyone, but it didn't go far enough. So we needed the renewable fuel standard, which created a mandate to use a certain level of ever increasing gallons of mostly corn derived ethanol, but also some cellulosic and other types of fuel into our gasoline supply. But it's become harder and harder for the EPA to administer that over the years. They've said that as much in their rulemakings, and it's also evidenced in their often very delayed rulemakings on this, because our cars are getting more and more efficient, and people are driving fewer cars that are reliant on gasoline. So there aren't enough gallons of traditional gas to put more corn into without exceeding the traditional 10% blend wall, as it was often called. That's why you see efforts to increase ethanol to E15, a 15% blend year-round, which has negative repercussions for the atmosphere, for pollution, smog, and things like that. And a lot of vehicles still on the road can't really use it very well. Plus, anyone who drives a boat, operates a motorcycle, uses small engines like in your lawnmower or things like that, higher blends are not good for that either. And I won't go into all the downstream, again, a pun, dead zone pun, problems with RFS, but there isn't any more room for corn in our family vehicle fuel supply, which is one reason why this is such a boon for corn growers, other feedstock growers, and fuel producers, because now there's another place to put all this corn. And especially if we're keeping all the corn inside our borders, we're going to have a major glut to deal with. Of course, we would never consider growing less or growing something else that people want to eat or would be better for the environment. But for now, the plan is to keep growing more. And I should also add at the same time, because someone mentioned in the Q&A that we are, an amazingly technologically savvy and creative country. The yield for corn has gone up. So we're growing more with less, which is amazing. But it's unclear whether we need more. And that's really the relationship that I see between these two policies and how they intersect, and why I'm worried about what happens when this turns from a credit, which has its own costly implications, into a mandate.
Yeah, I would agree that it's unclear whether the U.S., and American consumers need more corn, but I do think that it's pretty clear that with the world growing, richer and larger by the day, for the most part, that global demand is rising. The world still needs more corn, mostly for livestock feed, also in some cases for food, more soybean oil for vegetable oil, which actually provides a pretty sizable share of many people's calories. So, I think that really just underscores the importance of having this cropland available for producing for the livestock feed and food markets, and really the value globally of ensuring that there are international markets for those products as much as possible.
Yeah.
And it's not all about tariffs. That's certainly where most of the focus is right now. But there are so many non-tariff barriers to exports of agricultural products, various phytosanitary standards, but mostly just protectionist barriers that countries erect because they want to protect their own farmers. And there's an enormous, I think, opportunity to reduce some of those barriers and have a more free flowing trade of these really important commodities.
So I will add that as a side note, there has always been a historic preference for moving corn in a liquid state versus solid, going all the way back to the Whiskey Rebellion, because it's a lot cheaper. So, but that's one
Interesting.
reason why. So there, Dan was right. There are a lot of ups and downs to having the corn in its different form, and it has a lot of different needs and places that it could go. But that's why, at least at our street, we believe government shouldn't be the one making that choice. Other governments or ours, the market usually is really good at determining where best and how best this should be used without dealing with waste and a lot of the other harmful unintended consequences that come with picking winners and losers.
All right. Well, I would ask each of you if you have any final thoughts, just kind of as we've been bouncing around, anything that you want to add. Alex, do you want to go first? Anything?
Sure. Yeah, I'll do a quick sort of big picture. I think, yeah, having broader policies, so broader pro-investment policies on the business side, and ideally you pair that with some kind of modest carbon price as an incentive for actually good investment in reducing emissions. But in the context of specifically what you hear brought up a lot about with the biofuels and sustainable aviation fuel is aviation emissions. These are relatively difficult to mitigate, and I think one sort of underrated policy is actually the pro-investment provisions. The 100% bonus depreciation for equipment actually has some positive spillovers for aviation emissions, where recently in places where we've seen some downward pressure on emissions from aviation has been through reinvestment in new, better engines and new planes that are just higher quality. As we have like innovated in the industry, you have like higher fuel economy, better fuel economy, which can reduce emissions per passenger, and so incentive to reinvest generally will accelerate that sort of trend in the industry. And I think that is a real sort of secondary benefit to the sort of broad pro-investment pro-growth policy that raises productivity and raises wages, but it can also have these sort of minor additional benefits in the environmental space.
I'll just end on noting that the approaches and methods that the federal government develops for estimating greenhouse gas emissions from biofuels and different farming practices, they're not just limited to 45Z. These approaches are often adopted by companies or influence companies and voluntary carbon offset protocols. They've been adopted by states. We see California and their low carbon fuel standard using these federally developed models. And so the implications of these choices and basically how grounded they are in modern economics for the modeling and modern science for the impacts of these practices are really substantial.
I'll just really build on what Alex mentioned. The recommendations that he had for pro-growth tax reforms are mostly things that are widely available to all industries. Other changes in the tax code are likewise widely available to individual taxpayers. And the more we treat industries and individuals, producers, the more we treat everyone the same when it comes to our tax code and other policies, the less harmful downstream effects we have and the more efficient and dynamic the market becomes. And I think that's the best way to achieve growth for everyone.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Yeah, thanks to our panelists. This was I learned a lot, so I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.